The wind screamed. Snow bit at the glass. A howl, then a whimper. Elias, a man who had curated a life of meticulous silence, paused, the book in his hands forgotten. The sound was wrong. It was thin, desperate, and almost entirely swallowed by the blizzard's fury. He had spent 5 years in this remote cabin, a self-imposed exile from a world that measured a man by his successes and remembered only his failures. Here, there was only the steady rhythm of the seasons and the predictable demands of his own quiet existence. But this sound, this tiny thread of life in the maelstrom, was an anomaly. It was a question asked of the storm, and he felt an unwelcome compulsion to answer it. Pulling on his heavy coat, the fabric stiff with cold, he stepped into the white chaos. The wind stole his breath. Snow lashed his face, sharp as sand. He followed the sound, a ghost of a cry that led him toward the ancient pine at the edge of his property. There, huddled in a hollow at its base, was a small, shivering creature, a ball of spotted fur, dusted with a killing layer of snow. He knelt, his gloved fingers brushing away the ice. The cub was impossibly small, its eyes sealed shut. He saw the distinct rosettes on its coat, and his mind, the mind of a professionally competent veterinarian, supplied an immediate, logical answer. A savanna cat, an expensive hybrid, probably abandoned, a tragic and foolish casualty of the storm. He told himself this with absolute certainty, a lie he would later understand he desperately needed to believe. He scooped up the frozen body, tucking it inside his coat where the last of his warmth resided. Inside, the cabin was a fortress of quiet order. Books were stacked by spine color, instruments were sterilized and arranged by size, and the fire burned with a managed, even heat. The cub, now wrapped in a worn wool blanket on the hearth, was a smudge of wildness in his pristine world. He worked with practiced efficiency, warming a solution of electrolytes and glucose, preparing a dropper. For years, his hands had been his only trusted companions, steady, capable, and detached. But as he gently squeezed the first drops into the cub's mouth and felt the faintest tremor of a swallowing reflex, a crack appeared in the sterile wall around his heart. He sat back, watching the small chest rise and fall, a fragile rhythm against the storm's violent percussion. He was haunted by a memory, a different animal, a different frantic night under the harsh glare of surgical lights. A mistake, a single moment of hesitation that had cost a life and shattered his confidence. That failure had chased him here, to this place where he could do no more harm. He had promised himself that. Yet here was a life, small and conditional, resting entirely in his hands. The hours passed. The storm raged on, but inside, a different kind of quiet settled. It was not the empty silence of solitude, but a watchful stillness, a shared breath. As the first hints of dawn filtered gray through the snow-caked windows, the cub stirred. It stretched its tiny limbs, a flash of black-tipped tail, and then it looked at him. Its eyes, now open, were a startling shade of amber, and they held not the milky confusion of a kitten, but an unsettling, ancient intelligence. It watched him, a long, unblinking appraisal. And then, from its small chest, came a sound. It wasn't a mew. It wasn't a purr. It was a soft, vibrating exhalation, a delicate chuffing sound that vibrated in the still air of the cabin, the first, unmistakable sign of its true nature. The first few weeks were a blur of calculated denial. Elias named her Nala, a soft name for what he insisted was a soft creature. He established a routine born of his veterinary training, a schedule of feedings and weigh-ins, and meticulous record-keeping. He charted her growth on a graph, the upward curve impossibly steep. She grew with a speed that defied the biology of any domestic cat he knew. Her paws, initially so delicate, became disproportionately large. Her legs lengthened, transforming her clumsy toddle into a stalk of unnerving grace. During the day, he was the clinician, the professional, observing her with a detached curiosity. He noted the way she chirped in response to birds outside the window, the strange, flexible bend of her spine as she stretched. These were data points, anomalies he filed away. But at night, with Nala asleep by the fire, her spotted flank rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm, the clinician would recede. He would find himself lost in research, scrolling through images of ocelots, servals, marbled cats. He actively avoided the one page, the one species his instincts screamed at him to examine. The lie was a fragile shelter, and he huddled within it, justifying his actions with a quiet, desperate logic. He was just keeping her until the roads cleared, just until she was strong enough to be taken to a proper shelter. Just for a little while. This mantra became the quiet rhythm of his days, a counterpoint to the growing evidence of the truth. Their bond formed in the silent language of shared space. He would read in his worn armchair, and she would sleep on the rug nearby. Tentative at first, her playfulness emerged in sudden, startling bursts. She would stalk a drifting dust bunny with the low-slung intensity of a seasoned hunter, her body coiling and releasing in a movement too fluid, too powerful for a house cat. He found himself charmed by her wildness, by the way she would bat at his hand with a soft paw, her claws carefully sheathed. He would talk to her, his voice rusty from disuse, filling the silence he had once craved with soft observations about the weather, about the book he was reading. He was connecting again, and the realization was both a comfort and a terror. The man who had fled the world to avoid emotional risk was now tethered to this small, wild creature. His professional knowledge was at constant war with his growing affection. He knew the regulations. He knew the profound irresponsibility of what he was doing. He could feel the ghost of his past failure looming, a warning that attachments to wild things were paid for with heartbreak. But then Nala would chuff, that soft, breathy sound of greeting, and the walls of his logic would crumble. He needed this connection, this fragile purpose that had washed up in the storm. One evening, she was chasing the red dot of a laser pointer he had found in an old drawer. He moved the light across the floor, and she followed, a blur of focused energy. He flicked it up the wall, and she launched herself after it, landing silently, impossibly high on a bookshelf. She turned to look down at him, her amber eyes glowing in the firelight. For a moment, she was not a charming kitten, but a creature of breathtaking power and alien grace. As she playfully stalked a dust bunny across the wooden floor, her movements were not a clumsy pounce, but a miniature, perfect explosion of speed. Her body flowed like water, impossibly fluid and fast. Elias felt a profound pang of awe, a veterinarian's appreciation for a perfect biological machine. It was a feeling immediately followed by a cold, heavy wave of dread. By the third month, the lie became unsustainable. Nala was no longer a cub. She was a lanky, long-limbed adolescent, all legs and restless energy. The cabin, once a sufficient fortress, was beginning to feel like a cage. Her growth chart no longer showed a steep curve. It was a vertical ascent. Elias had expanded his lie to himself, theorizing she was some kind of savanna cat with a gigantism disorder, a one-in-a-million genetic fluke. It was a desperate, scientific-sounding fantasy, and it shattered on a Tuesday morning in late spring. Elias was at the window, coffee in hand, watching the snow melt drip from the pines. Nala was outside in the small, fenced-in yard he had painstakingly constructed, a concession to her growing need to run. A young doe, careless and naive, wandered to the edge of the clearing. Nala saw it. She froze. Her body dropped low to the ground, every muscle tensed. The change was instantaneous and absolute. The playful companion vanished, replaced by something ancient and lethal. Then she moved. It wasn't a run, it was an explosion. A flash of dun and black. A streak of impossible speed. She covered 50 yards in the time it took Elias to draw a breath. The deer, startled, bolted, but Nala was a liquid shadow flowing over the uneven ground, her head perfectly still, her legs a blur. She wasn't chasing. She was flowing, a predator perfectly in sync with her prey. She never caught it. The fence brought her up short in a spray of damp earth. But the image was burned into Elias's mind. The form was unmistakable. The elongated spine flexing and releasing like a spring. The small head and long tail acting as a rudder for balance. The loping, impossibly fast gait. His breath hitched. The carefully constructed walls of his denial didn't just crack, they vaporized. All, terror, and a profound, world-altering sense of having crossed a line from which there was no return. The cat was a cheetah, a Synax jubatus, a creature of the African savanna, not the North American wilderness. His veterinarian's mind, finally unshackled, flooded with facts. Cheetahs are the fastest land animals on Earth, capable of speeds up to 70 miles per hour. Their semi-retractable claws act like cleats for traction. Their unique respiratory system allows for rapid oxygen intake during a chase. They are not climbers like leopards. They are sprinters, built for open plains. Everything about her, her biology, her instincts, her very existence here, was an impossibility. A biological ghost. How had she gotten here? An escaped exotic pet? A survivor of a crash transport? The questions were irrelevant. The reality was standing in his yard, panting softly, her focus still on the spot where the deer had disappeared. He slid the door open and whispered her name. Nala. She turned, and the morning sun caught her face. He saw them clearly for the first time, not as markings, but as what they were. The iconic black, tear-stained lines running from the corners of her eyes down the sides of her nose. They were there to reduce the sun's glare, an adaptation for a hunter who scans the bright horizon of a world thousands of miles away. He saw not a pet, not an anomaly, but a breathtaking predator, a masterpiece of evolution stranded in the wrong life. The secret was no longer a comfort. It was a beautiful, dangerous burden. The year that followed was a season of impossible peace. Having accepted the truth, Elias stopped fighting it and instead built a world around it. He and Nala existed in a bubble of their own making, a secret life governed by the rising and setting of the sun. Their days settled into a rhythm that was part domestic and part wild. Mornings began just before dawn. Elias would wake to find Nala already waiting, her gaze fixed on the window. They would go out into the chilled air together, two silent figures watching the world awaken. This became their ritual, a time of quiet communion where words were unnecessary. He would sip his coffee, and she would sit beside him, a warm, solid presence. Her chuffs and chirps a unique language he came to understand as intimately as his own thoughts. Her physical growth continued, but it was paralleled by his own emotional healing. The crushing silence that had once defined his home was replaced by the soft padding of her paws on the wooden floor, the gentle rumble of her contentment, the occasional, startling burst of her speed as she raced across the yard he had quietly, painstakingly enlarged. He learned the landscape of her moods, the focused stillness that meant she was watching something far beyond the fence, the relaxed, almost lazy affection she reserved only for him. He saw both her natures in stark relief. With him, she was gentle, nudging his hand for attention, resting her head on his lap as he read in the evenings. But he also saw the predator. He saw it in the way she tracked a hawk circling overhead, her body a coiled spring of potential energy. He saw it in the lethal speed she would unleash upon a falling leaf, a playful act that was nonetheless a perfect rehearsal for the hunt. Their bond was a paradox. He, the man who had retreated from responsibility, was now wholly responsible for a life that defied every rule he had ever known. And she, a creature born to roam vast, open spaces, had found a strange contentment in the confines of his isolated world. He was her provider, her companion, her entire herd. In return, she was his anchor, the living, breathing reason he had begun to feel again. The seasons marked their time together. In summer, her coat seemed to burn gold in the long evenings. In autumn, her tawny spots were a perfect camouflage against the fallen leaves. In winter, she loved the snow, bounding through drifts with an explosive joy that made him laugh out loud, a sound that startled them both. He was no longer just her caretaker. He was her family, an impossible, secret family of two. He was breaking laws, both federal and natural, but the emotional truth of their connection felt more real, more valid than any regulation. Watching the sun rise one crisp autumn morning, with Nala's solid weight resting beside him and her soft chuffing vibrating through the wood of the porch, Elias realized something profound. This was the first time in years he had felt something that could be called peace. It wasn't the sterile quiet of his former solitude, but a deep, resonant calm. A borrowed peace on borrowed time. The bubble burst on a clear afternoon in July. The air was hot and still, humming with the drone of insects. Elias was inside, cleaning his veterinary tools, a meditative task he still performed out of habit. Nala was outside, dozing in a patch of shade under the old oak tree. The sound started as a distant whine, a high-pitched annoyance that grew steadily louder. Elias looked up, frowning. It wasn't a plane. It was lower, more agile. He stepped outside and saw it. a small, white conservation drone, making a methodical grid pattern over the forest. It was probably mapping wildlife populations or checking for signs of forest fire. To its operator, miles away, his property was just another square of green on a screen. But in that square of green was a golden, spotted anomaly that did not belong. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He hissed her name, his voice tight with urgency. Nala. Inside now. For a terrifying second, she just lifted her head, blinking in the sun. The drone banked, its camera lens sweeping directly towards his yard. Nala, he yelled, his voice cracking. This time, she responded to the terror in his tone. She rose in a fluid motion and trotted towards the cabin. Elias felt like time was slowing down. Every step she took seemed agonizingly slow. The drone hummed closer, a mechanical insect hovering over their secret world. He scrambled to get her through the door, his hands shaking as he slid it shut and pulled the curtains. His heart hammered against his ribs. He stood in the dim light of the cabin, listening, his breath held tight. The whine of the drone grew louder, passed directly overhead, and then began to fade as it continued on its programmed path. He waited until the sound was gone completely, swallowed by the familiar drone of the summer afternoon. The immediate danger had passed, but something had irrevocably broken. The illusion of their safe, isolated paradise was shattered. The outside world, with its rules and its consequences, was not just a distant memory. It was flying overhead. The close call planted a seed of doubt that began to fester. He had always told himself he was protecting her, giving her a life she otherwise would not have had. But was that true? Or was he simply endangering her, keeping her a prisoner of his own loneliness? By hiding her from the world, was he robbing her of a chance at a real life? However complicated that might be, a few days later, the phone rang, a jarring sound in the quiet house. It was an old colleague, Sarah, from the veterinary practice he'd abandoned. Her voice was a cheerful intrusion from a lifetime ago. She was calling about a complex case, a serval that had been illegally imported and was now in their care, and she wanted his opinion. "You were always the best with the exotics, Elias," she said, her tone casual. He answered her questions automatically, his mind working through the diagnostics with the old, familiar competence. He gave her his advice, his voice steady and professional. But as he spoke, he looked at Nala, who was watching him from the rug, her head tilted with curiosity. Every word he said about proper enclosures, enrichment, and the psychological needs of non-domesticated felines was a judgment against himself. He was living a hypocrisy of the highest order. After he hung up, the professional world he had abandoned felt both impossibly distant and terrifyingly close. He was a fraud, breaking the very codes of conduct he had once helped to write. The drone disappeared over the ridge that day, but the silence it left behind was different. It was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with exposure, thick with the weight of a secret that had become too large to hide. The weeks following the drone incident were fraught with a new, quiet tension. Elias found himself watching Nala not just as a companion, but as a subject. He saw the subtle signs of her restlessness, the things his affection had previously allowed him to ignore. He saw the way she would spend hours near the fence at the far end of the property, her body rigid, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. Her muscles would twitch, as if dreaming of a run she could never complete. Her chirps and calls, once a comforting part of their shared language, now sounded like questions he couldn't answer. She was healthy, she was safe, but she was not fulfilled. Her wild instincts, the very essence of what made her so magnificent, were straining against the invisible walls of her confinement. She needed space. She needed the horizon. She needed, he realized with a pang of devastating clarity, her own kind. One evening, he sat on the porch, an open veterinary textbook on his lap. He wasn't reading it. He was just watching her pace the perimeter of the yard, a fluid, golden shadow in the twilight. She was a perfect creature in an imperfect world, and he was the architect of that imperfection. He understood then that his love for her, if it was real, had to be bigger than his need for her. True love, he thought, wasn't about holding on. It was about honoring the true nature of the beloved, even if it meant letting go. This quiet, internal realization was the true climax of their story. Not a shout, but a whisper. The decision settled over him, heavy and absolute. His grief was immediate and profound, but underneath it was a bedrock of certainty. He had rescued her from a blizzard, but now he had to rescue her from himself. His research at night changed. He no longer looked for ways to justify keeping her. He looked for a future for her. His searches were now for wildlife sanctuaries, conservation centers, places with sprawling, savanna-like habitats, and, most importantly, other cheetahs. His actions were slow, deliberate, each keystroke filled with a quiet sorrow. He printed out information, his hand trembling slightly as he read about rewilding protocols and the complex social structures of cheetah coalitions. This was no longer a secret to be kept, but a problem to be solved, his final act of service to her. He pulled out a small, dusty box from the back of his closet. Inside was a handful of mementos from his old life, including a worn photograph of his veterinary team, all smiling after a successful surgery on a snow leopard. He looked at his own face in the picture, younger and unburdened. He remembered the man he had been, driven, respected, part of a community dedicated to the welfare of animals. He had to become that man again, not for himself, but for her. With the photograph still in his hand, a tangible reminder of the professional he once was, he picked up the phone. His fingers hovered over the numbers for the state's Fish and Wildlife Department. He took a deep breath, the air in the silent cabin feeling thick and heavy. With trembling hands, he made the call. His voice, when he spoke, was surprisingly steady, quiet and clear, sealing their fate with 7 simple words. I need to report an exotic animal. The arrival was less dramatic than Elias had feared. There were no flashing lights, no swarm of officers. Just a single, mud-splattered SUV that pulled quietly up his long driveway 2 days later. Out stepped a man in his late 50s with a weathered face and calm, intelligent eyes. He introduced himself as Dr. Eris Thorne, a conservationist with the Global Wildlife Sanctuary Alliance. He represented the antagonist Elias had been dreading, the embodiment of regulations, reason, and the world that would judge him. Thorne's demeanor was professional, clinical, and carried an air of deep skepticism. He had seen too many well-intentioned people make catastrophic mistakes with wild animals. Elias met him on the porch, not with emotional pleas, but with the quiet competence he had long since abandoned. He led Thorne into the cabin and handed him a thick binder. "These are my logs," Elias said, his voice even. "Everything is in there. Growth charts, diet, observed behaviors, vaccinations I was able to administer." Thorne took the binder, his eyebrows raising slightly. He flipped through the pages. They were filled with Elias's neat, precise handwriting, detailing every aspect of Nala's life with the meticulousness of a scientific study. There were notes on her vocalizations, her sleep patterns, her response to environmental stimuli. It was the work of a highly skilled professional, not a sentimental pet owner. Thorne's expression shifted from skepticism to grudging respect. "You're a vet," he stated, not as a question. "I was," Elias corrected softly. The real test came when Elias led him to the window overlooking the yard where Nala was resting. Thorne drew a sharp, involuntary breath. He had seen cheetahs his entire life, in Africa, in zoos, in other sanctuaries. But to see one here, in the temperate forest of North America, was a profound dislocation of the natural order. "I need to assess her condition," Thorne said, his voice regaining its clinical edge. Elias nodded. He opened the back door and spoke softly. "Nala, come on, girl. It's okay." At the sound of his voice, Nala rose and trotted towards them. She was wary of the stranger, her body language tense, but her trust in Elias was absolute. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze shifting from Thorne to Elias, seeking reassurance. Thorne stood perfectly still, observing. He watched as Elias spoke to her in that low, gentle tone, as the cheetah's posture visibly relaxed. He saw her lean in slightly, nudging Elias's hand before emitting that soft, unmistakable chuff of greeting. The sound seemed to hang in the air, a testament to a bond that defied all textbooks and protocols. Thorne, the man of science and regulations, was momentarily speechless. He saw not just an illegally kept animal, but a complex emotional dynamic he could not explain. He saw trust where there should have been fear. He saw communication where there should have been a barrier. His clinical gaze softened, melting into something that looked like quiet awe. "I've never seen anything like it," Thorne admitted, and for the first time, His voice lost its detached, professional edge. The days that followed became a period of structured transition, a slow, painful process of teaching Nala to leave him. Elias worked alongside Thorn, a strange partnership forged in mutual respect for the animal at the center of their lives. Thorn, for his part, recognized that Elias's deep connection was their greatest asset in ensuring a smooth and low-stress transfer for Nala. Their first task was the transport crate. Thorn brought it in, a large, sterile metal box that smelled of unfamiliar places. To Nala, it was a threat. To Elias, it was the vessel of their goodbye. The training was an exercise in patience and heartache. Each step was a small act of letting go. He began by simply placing her food bowl near the crate, then just inside the open door. He used the same soft, reassuring phrase over and over. "Easy now, easy does it." It was the same phrase he had whispered to her when she was a half-frozen cub, shivering in a blanket by the fire. Now, he was using it to teach her to trust this cage that would take her away from him. He would sit by the crate for hours, reading aloud, making it a part of their shared space until she finally, tentatively, stepped inside to retrieve a piece of meat. The click of the door swinging shut for the first time during a training session was a sound that echoed the finality of what was to come. Their familiar routines were now imbued with the sorrow of a final act. Their morning ritual on the porch felt different, heavier. He found himself trying to commit every detail to memory, the precise pattern of spots on her face, the way her ears swiveled to catch a distant sound, the warm weight of her resting against his leg. These moments, once a source of simple peace, were now bittersweet, each one a pearl of memory he was storing up against the coming silence. Thorn handled the logistics, the permits, the flight plans. He spoke of the sanctuary in glowing terms, hundreds of acres of rolling grassland, a habitat designed to mimic the African plains, a coalition of other cheetahs waiting. It was the perfect place for her. It was everything he couldn't provide, and every word of it, meant to be reassuring, felt like a small twist of the knife. Elias knew it was right. He never wavered in his decision. But the rightness of the act did nothing to dull the pain of it. He was dismantling their life together, piece by piece, for her sake. It was the ultimate act of love, and it felt exactly like breaking his own heart. The night before she was scheduled to leave, a profound stillness settled over the cabin. Thorn had gone to a hotel in the nearest town, leaving them to their last hours. Elias didn't pack. He didn't prepare. He didn't sleep. He just sat on the floor by the fireplace, Nala resting beside him, her head in his lap. He stroked her coarse fur, his fingers tracing the tear-stained lines on her face. He committed every detail of the moment to memory, the quiet hum of her presence a sound he knew, with a certainty that ached in his bones he would never hear again. The journey began before dawn. The air was cold and carried the scent of rain. Nala, lightly sedate. A year later, spring. The world was green and alive again. Elias was different. The profound isolation he had once cultivated was gone, replaced by a quiet engagement with the world. He hadn't returned to his old life, but he had built a new one. 3 days a week, he volunteered at a local animal shelter, his skilled hands and calm demeanor a gift to the frightened, abandoned animals he cared for. He was reconnecting with his purpose, not in the high-stakes world of exotic veterinary medicine, but in the simple, essential work of offering comfort. The silence of his cabin was no longer an oppressive force. It was simply quiet, a peaceful backdrop to a life that felt whole again. He packed a small bag one Friday morning and started to drive. It was a long journey, one he had replayed in his mind 100 times. He was driving to the sanctuary, not to interfere, not to reclaim something that was never his, but simply to witness. He arrived as a visitor, an anonymous face in a small group taking a guided tour. He kept to the back, his heart a steady, quiet drum in his chest. From a distant viewing platform, he looked out over the vast, savanna-like enclosure. The guide pointed out the different animals, his voice a drone of facts and figures that Elias barely heard. He was scanning, searching, and then he saw her. He knew her instantly. She was with 2 other cheetahs, sleeker, more muscled than he remembered. Her coat shone in the sun. She was magnificent, a creature of breathtaking power and grace, perfectly at home in the sweeping landscape. She was wild, as she was always meant to be. He watched as the 3 of them engaged in a sudden, explosive chase, a playful, joyous sprint across the grassland. Nala was a blur of focused energy, her body a testament to evolutionary perfection. She was impossibly fast, impossibly beautiful. She was thriving. The sight filled him not with the ache of loss he had feared, but with a profound, overwhelming sense of rightness. This was the successful outcome. This was his quiet triumph. As the chase ended, Nala paused, turning to look out across the plains. For a brief, impossible moment, she seemed to look directly towards the viewing platform, her head tilted as if sensing a familiar, distant presence on the wind. It was just a moment, a flicker. Then she turned, chirped to her companions, and trotted off with them, a part of her world, a part of her family. She didn't need him anymore. He knew that now, and that knowledge was the final piece of his own healing. The tour moved on, but he stayed behind for a few moments, just watching her disappear into the tall grass. He had found her in a blizzard, a life on the brink of being extinguished. In saving her, he had inadvertently caged her, and in letting her go, he had saved himself. Transformation is permanent, even if circumstances change. He was no longer the broken man who had found her, and she was no longer the helpless cub who had needed him. They had rescued each other. He walked back to his car, a quiet smile on his face. He leaves, not with the ache of loss, but with a profound sense of gratitude that filled his entire being. The silence in his car on the way home is no longer empty. It's just quiet,